We're going to be continuing on question number 7, which we call, and I'm glad you asked, these 7 out of 12. And we're not doing these in any consecutive sequence, but the fundamental question of what about those who never heard? And it comes out of the idea that if God has made this provision for us in his grace in Christ Jesus, then the dilemma is, why doesn't everybody get this, you see? And so it's a question of fairness, and that's really what the question is. So I'll just review very quickly a couple of the components here. We're looking at the idea of the exclusiveness of the gospel, and so the question is whether God is fair, or does he care? Now, what we're talking here about then is whether God should give us justice or whether he should give us grace. And from a human point of view, we think we should get justice, which is everybody getting the same thing. Don't ask for God for justice. We've talked before. To get justice is to get what you deserve. And if we got all of us got justice, we would all be in a Christless eternity. Because you see, the problem isn't ignorance of the cure. It is actually the disease itself. And the scriptures make it clear, and our own experience supports this, that we would say we would like to do the better thing, and we find ourselves not always doing that. We can't live up with our own moral systems, and everyone finds this to be a universal kind of an experience that we have. So there were 3 options we began to look at. The first of those options is, well, he won't judge those who haven't heard. So that is the case then. If they never heard, then there's really no problem because they're going to be innocent, but it doesn't work that way. Because you see, we don't die from ignorance of the cure. We die from the disease, you see. So the question is going to be then, and it would also make us wonder, why would then Jesus in his last words tell his followers to convey this word, the Great Commission, to make this word known? And then also in Acts 1:8, you'll be my witnesses. So what would be the good of doing that? You see, actually, you might be doing them a disservice if their ignorance then meant that they would be not judged. Because effectively, then you're put them in a position where they should be judged, you see. So you're actually making it worse for them, taking them from blissful ignorance to actually a miserable conviction and understanding that there's something wrong here. And so the issue of whether there are certain principles that will help us process this, because it comes down to this. If God gave us justice, we would have no hope. But God doesn't give us justice, he gives us grace. But the receptivity of that grace is a divine human process. And we have an option. We can receive or reject that offer of God's grace. And that is the dignity of the human condition. But the love and holiness of God is very, very clear. But we are saying that we died because of disease, not because of ignorance of the proper cure. And so the question then is going to be whether we are going to hear this message. And the second option then is, okay, if he's going to judge those who haven't heard, the question is, isn't it unfair? Jeremiah, we said, 17:10, I'm just summarizing a couple of things. I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give to every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. And so we have the idea that with the scriptures then, that God's judgment is based, and this is very critical, it's based on the knowledge people already have. And he does not hold us accountable to knowledge we do not have or cannot know. And that's a very important principle. So he is giving us then he's giving us an offer of better than we deserve. We cannot demand anything from him, but he's given us better than we could have ever hoped. But people will be judged according to the revelation that they have been given and the moral standard that they themselves have acknowledged. So this is why I say responsibility is proportionate to revelation. And there are some other principles, and we'll review those together as well. The point here is that we said already that everyone has enough knowledge about God to seek him. We saw this in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. And so if we look at Romans 1, and before I go there, though, this is a very important verse in front of us. Everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. So this whole idea of ask and seek and knock, that if a person wants to know, then God, if a person responds to the light they've been given, the scriptures make it very clear, and there are numerous principles here that underscore the idea that he will actually then provide them more light. If you've been responded to the light you've been given, he will then provide more light. How he does that will be entirely his graceful ways and his manners in which he does this. But in Romans 18, we've seen that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. He's claiming that they already have a knowledge that's being suppressed. And that was because he says that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So he's referring to the human condition that all of us have some knowledge of God by virtue of an interior knowledge as well as an exterior knowledge, that his created order reveals something about his eternal power and divine nature. So he goes on to say, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have, he says, been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. And it keeps coming down to the knowledge of the world itself and access that we have to things that others, I love this thing, that access to this marvelous and wonderful world that we see before us, that we can observe and see and draw certain conclusions from these marvels that the more you study and the more you look at them, the more incredible they become. And we're privileged, as I've told you before, to see things that others in biblical times had no clue. They had no idea about most of these things that we now know and take for granted in many ways. So you see from the heights of the heavens, nobody could have seen an image that you're seeing right now until our time. So if anything, he's actually magnified and amplified that knowledge. But this was always known. There's enough knowledge about the created order for us to see. And though do not have as much, they didn't have as much knowledge as we do about the created order, although they were closer to it and understood things from that. Nevertheless, everything we point to, everything we look at is a marvel and a wonder. So the Romans text makes it very clear then that there's an accountability that is necessary. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. They became futile in their speculations. Their foolish heart was darkened. And professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So there is a degradation that takes place. A spiritual blindness leads then to an intellectual darkness where they're now pursuing things that are unworthy of their pursuit. They became fools. And they're not grasping that the objects of the created order that they're turning into gods and goddesses are really in their own form. So he gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies would be dishonored among them. But if you look at Romans chapter 1, we've talked before about the spiritual darkness, which leads then to the intellectual darkness. And that in turn has produced a moral darkness. And if you want a great vision or understanding of our time, is more true now in many ways than ever before, we see this manifestation being evident so that people then are without excuse. And so as we continue on then, he speaks of an external revelation, and this is a general revelation available to all people. And so this is known. Psalm 19, for example, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. And so when we consider this extraordinary text, then we realize that God has provided knowledge for us and throughout the scriptures, the more you look and the more you see that he did not leave himself without witness. And so we understand this. As I say, those of us who spend much of our lives with the night sky shrouded by light pollution of cities and suburbia may be tempted to take these passages lightly, but most, as you know, have been in an agricultural context. But the reality is that these things are evident to all of us, and we are now accountable. And there's a second form. It's not just external, but also internal. That God has made himself known because of his created order. And this is why I now find myself using the physical, the visible manifestations to point beyond it themselves to the spiritual truths that they illustrate. But it's also an internal knowledge, apart just from nature. We all have a conscience. And he speaks about this idea that God has made it, because we're image bearers, we have a conscience, an internal revelation. And so this concept then of how in the religious quest has evolved from a primal monotheism, as we mentioned last time, that really these all non-Christian religions teach that salvation is achieved by human effort, by ritual, sacrifice, devotional service. And whether their view of ultimate reality is rather a kind of a non-believing view, that is to say that there is nothing actually palpable or manifest, if it's like a polytheism on the one hand, or it could be an animism or spiritualism. It could be some form of nature mysticism. But no matter what the view is, or if there is gods or gods, the fact is that all of these views are really are methods or attempts to achieve or placate or earn or attain. They're all human efforts. And the only one that is not is actually the gospel of salvation by grace through faith. What's significant is that they teach us, though, the only way you can actually bridge this gap, whatever it is to reduce the holiness of God and also the wretchedness of sin. So, in fact, as people grow in Christ, they become more and more aware that he's a lot greater than they thought they were, and they're a lot worse than they thought they were. And that's a process, you see. And so the only way you could bridge that gap would have the delusionary notion that you can somehow, could live in a way that's going to be acceptable, that maybe God will grade in a curve, is the concept there. So they're hoping that maybe I'm better than most people, he'll let me in, but they don't grasp that he cannot compromise himself. Last week I gave you this phrase, I'll use it again, because it's an interesting way to put it. The righteousness that God requires is that righteousness which his righteousness requires him to require. See? The righteousness that God requires is that righteousness which his righteousness requires him to require, which means he can't grade in a curve. That he cannot lower his standards. Because if he said, okay, I'll let you in, just don't let me catch you over there, it would not be heaven at all. It would just be, in fact, something that would multiply the problem. He's done this before with the flood, and again, because people were not perfect, it comes back. And so we have this issue is dealing with a standard that's so high that it's utterly unattainable. And so human works will never bridge the gap. So that we have this concept here that there's a standard as well in Romans 2. So you have two things. One is external, and another one's internal. Because we're image bearers, we can't get eternity out of our hearts because he's made us that way in his image. We're spiritual beings having this earthbound, very brief sojourn, but we're actually spiritual beings, but we're embodied beings. And so because we are spiritual beings, we have a consciousness then of God who is spirit, but we also have a moral standard inside of us. And this moral standard is a conscience that he's given to us, and we can't even keep our own standards. So that if we say, whatever the standards are, what I want people to do is this or that, this is how I want to be treated, or if people should treat each other. But do we do it consistently? Do we do it perfectly? Do we do it all the time? So our own standards really will ultimately condemn us, because we all think and say and do things we don't want to say and think and do. We find ourselves falling short of our own standards, and this is the whole problem. So we might say, what about a person who flawlessly obeys his moral code? But show me someone who does. There's no one who does this. So this really produces this dilemma, the dilemma of conscience. And when it says, when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, he says, although they don't have the law, they're a law to themselves. And so it's written in their conscience. This concept of conscience is a very intriguing one because it's the concept of knowing right from wrong. Romans 2:15 makes it very clear we have that. We have a natural conscience. This is parenthetical. But we can sear our conscience by doing things that are inappropriate, that are incompatible with our own conscience, and we can then defile our conscience. The worst case is in evil conscience, where to justify your actions, you actually say that what's wrong is right and what's right is wrong. It's Isaiah 5:20. That's the culture in which we now find ourselves. People are taking the high moral ground on the things that the Bible condemns, and then they condemn the things the Bible approves. So it's an interesting, but they do it with the moral stance. They actually they take the high moral ground, they think, because you see what you're dealing with now is this conscience that is now being used to justify our own acts. So it's called an evil conscience. Whereas a regenerated conscience could be good, it could be clear, it could be blameless, but at any rate, this is a very important point for Paul to make. So we're looking at two things. Number one, the created order itself, and number two, internally, our conscience that we all have. So we find then that we are in a situation where we have a dilemma. And if we're honest with ourselves, we would see that there's a problem within and there's a God without. And if a person responds to that light, however they say it, if you're there, I want to know you, or let me reveal yourself, and God will provide to any heart who wants him that knowledge. How he does it is going to be up to him. He will not, however, and this is critical to the theme, he will not hold you accountable for knowledge you did not receive. So this is very important for us to see. He's not going to hold you accountable for that. But it tells us in Jeremiah 29, you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. You, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. So again, you have this concept here in the Psalms. And that the Lord is near to all who call upon him. Whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved, as it tells us in Romans 10. So the concept of if you seek him, this is a critical theme then. And as God himself puts it, the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. And the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. But seeking God is not just an intellectual process. There is a moral willingness to actually pursue him. So that's why, again, it comes down to this complex dynamic that God is making an offer of better than we deserve. And if he was fair, frankly, he wouldn't make the offer at all. He gives us an option, but at the awful price of underwriting his own price of righteousness. God is not mocked, and sin must be paid for. Either you will bear the consequences of your own sin, or by the grace of God, he's given us the option to actually receive the grace of the one who did bear the consequences of your own sin, which is an astonishing thought. Again, the uniqueness of the gospel is that he not only becomes one of us, the Word becomes flesh, but he comes not to live, but to die and to give his life so that we could live, so that therefore he can offer us salvation. He can justify us, declare us righteous, even though we weren't righteous. It's the righteousness of Christ now that's put on our account, so that God, his own standards are not violated. Therefore, God cannot forgive sin, but he can forgive the sinner because he's made an available offer to those who would be willing to receive his grace. So this is really, though, there's a spiritual process. The light's come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does the evil hates the light and does not come to the light lest his deeds should be exposed. He who practices the truth comes to the light that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. So there is this idea of something in the human heart, but that in the mysterious divine interface, if we respond to the gracious overtures, he will provide us more. So if any man, John 7:17 tells us, if any man is willing to do God's will, he will know of the truth, teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from himself. So there's a preliminary, a willingness to do his will, a willingness to call upon the name of the Lord. And that is a grace that God gives us, and yet we are still responsible for doing that. In one sense, there's no one who seeks after God, as the scriptures say. But on the other hand, if you seek, you will find. And so when we consider this idea, ask, seek, and find, and in Matthew 7, those who ask, what happens? It'll be given to them. Those who seek, they will find. Those who knock, it'll be open to them. So this is not a sham. He's offering us a bona fide offer, but we must, in fact, want that. And it's a harder thing than we might suppose, because it's to humble our own pride and to realize we couldn't actually contribute to this. But you see, no one pursues God with a whole heart or merits salvation by his works. So apart from God's grace, no one would seek him, yet we're still responsible. But he makes it possible for us to actually be players, participants, because the Holy Spirit can draw and he can convict us. And so those who, and this is the critical component, those who respond positively to the light they have already received will then gain more light. And he's seen fit to use his children as his primary means of providing additional light, hence the need for missions. And so the whole concept then is, how will they call upon him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach unless they are sent? And so the concept of God providing this available offer, and he's inviting us to be participants. And that's where the Great Commission comes, to go to all the nations and to make this message known. And then there are many examples where, for example, the incident with the Ethiopian eunuch, an illustration of God's providing further light for somebody who's responded to the light he's already got. He was reading in the text of Isaiah, and just as he reaches Isaiah 53, Philip comes up running up to him. So the interesting thing, if he hadn't run up to him, he would have missed the right chapter, because you see, he would have been in chapter 54 if he hadn't run up to the chariot. Interesting stuff. The timing of God, the provision, that God's the invisible master of ceremonies. When he knows this person wants the truth, he provides it. He could do it directly, but instead he chooses to use us. He gives us this instrumentality. Though, having said that, there are other instances in which God does directly speak in this manner. So Melchizedek would be an example of that, and others in this context would be people who have actually received direct communication by God. The Magi would be another example. The Ninevites as well, when under the preaching of Jonah. But the point is that there are people who call. And so what about people who never heard? This is the question then about what's happening in the world. There are massive revivals that are happening today. More people are coming to faith in Jesus and Yeshua HaMashiach today than have ever in the past. There's more of a reach in the gospel. You'll never read about this in the news, but it's extraordinary. Massive revivals are happening in the global south. And another thing is very interesting is that God has actually been giving visions as well to these Muslim lands. And many people now are reporting, a huge number of people reporting having these dreams, sometimes a whole village getting this dream. And in most of those instances, they're told that you need to go to this place, and there will be a person who will tell you about the message you need to hear. And God could do it directly, but he said he uses human instrumentality. Though again, as I said, Abraham, the Magi, and Saul is another example. He can do it directly. But I find it fascinating that in our time, that there's this unprecedented explosion of reports of Muslims having these dreams that directed them to ultimate faith in Jesus. And several of these testimonies are posted online at answeringislam.org. But the concept then is that God can make this known and make it available for all who would like to know this truth. I'll give you, there's one that I came across that was fascinating to me. And this was from an account in the 19th century, and it was in India. And there was remarkable providences and proofs of a divine revelation that was by John Richardson Phillips in 1876, a book that he wrote then. He speaks about a caravan that was crossing from one part of India to another, and a missionary was traveling with it. And as it passed along, a Hindu was so overcome by heat and weariness that he sank down and was left to perish in the road. The missionary saw him, and kneeling by his side, when the other travelers had passed on, he whispered into his ear, "Brother, what is your hope?" And the dying man raised himself up a little. With his last effort, gasped out, "The blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses from all sin." Where did he get that from? This guy in the desert. The astonished missionary wondered how this man, to all appearances a heathen, came to know Christ. Then he noticed a piece of paper that was grasped tightly in the dead man's hand. And it was a single leaf from a Bible. Who knows how it got there, how he found it, how he came across it, that contained the first chapter of John's first epistle, in which those words are found. Now, that's one, but there are thousands of these kinds of stories illustrating the fact that when a person responds to the light, more light can be provided. And we do not know the human heart. And so, therefore, I believe that the work of Christ, then, is something that transcends all of our time, our own chronological sense of movement in this world. It goes beyond it goes backwards, it's retroactive. So the Spirit of God uses the Word of God through men and women of God to take and make the message about the Son of God available to all who want to see Him. So the basis, and this is an important principle here in all ages, this whole idea, the basis of salvation has always been the death of Christ in all ages. That's why I want you to see again that effectively this arrow points backwards, because the work of Christ goes back to the first man, you see, and it extends to the last. And so that God transcends the boundaries of time and space because they're artifacts of His creation, and He Himself is not bounded by them. So indeed, there's a mystery. This is why I tell people that when you're praying for a person's salvation, in a way, you're really asking God to have done something before the foundation of the world. Think it through. Because if we were known before the foundation of the world, if He knew us in all the days that were written for us before we were even born, then for me to participate by praying for a person's salvation is effectively to have participated in something that happened before in the past, you see. So I can't figure that out because there's a deep and profound mystery, the mystery of God's relation to time. But we know that the cross works backwards. That's the basis. So that no one is saved by works. The basis is the death of Christ, and the means of salvation in all ages has always been grace through faith, not works, always. And the object of faith is God, and therein lies Romans 1 and 2. Romans 1, no one's ignorant about the one truth, unless they have not attained an age of accountability, and that's another point I'm going to make in just a moment. But the content of the faith, if you have more than general revelation, if you have special revelation, it amplifies the content of that faith. But it's important for us to see, though, that in all these things, then, we have this unified understanding that we're justified by grace through faith, and the object of that faith is God, and the content of the faith will be amplified as revelation is provided. And so again, we have examples of Gentiles who came to know the one true God: Rahab, Ruth, the Moabite, Naaman, the Syrian. But what about infants and those mentally incapable of understanding the gospel, which is a very relevant question, is it not? And again, and this is the principle I want to stress, that God does not hold accountable those who have not the capacity to make a decision about it. There are principles, I think, that we can see. One of the principles that I could offer is a concept of an age of accountability. And so recall that at Kadesh Barnea, all who would die in the wilderness would be those who were how many years old and upwards? 20 years old and upwards. So those who were under 20 were not going to be held accountable for that. There seems then to be some kind of a principle of accountability and the capability of reception. As well, the fairness of God and the concept of God's being fair has been very clearly more than fair. He's been gracious. So you can't prove the doctrine of infant salvation from the Bible. There are indeed some passages that I think that imply that infants in some special way are kept by the power of God. So if considered Christ's teaching in Matthew 18, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that they're angels in heaven. You notice this interesting statement. They're angels in heaven. I think this is where the concept of a guardian angel has come from. But it does tell us that they behold continuously my Father who's in heaven. It's not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. Let the children alone, do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. So there seems to be some special relation in that. And then another principle that you can draw is drawn by implication from King David, because after the loss of the infant who was born out of adultery with Bathsheba, when he was told, because he was fasting, hoping and praying that somehow the child would be spared. But when he found out that the child had died, he stopped fasting. And they asked him, what are you doing? Well, now you should be praying. But he says, no. He says, now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back to me again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. Well, that's a significant statement, because what he is saying there is that although David sinned, he knew the child would be with God, and he anticipated seeing him again. Again, it's not a proof, but it's a principle. And there are certain principles that we can see of accountability, this whole idea of reaching an age of accountability. Consider Revelation 5:9. He says, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed a people for God. How? Where? From every tribe and language and people and nation. This would include people then who were in North America, the Aztecs, Mayas, Incas. There'd be people from those groups, those people groups. How could that be? Well, consider if infants are covered by the atoning work of Christ because he's not going to hold us accountable for what we could not know, and they didn't reach this ability to do that, then in my view, it would be that they would constitute a large percentage, if not the majority, of those redeemed in heaven. As you probably know, until very recently, about the 20th century, about 20% of people died by the age of 5 due to infant mortality, about 20%. Now, that's not happening anymore. I mean, much, much less, at least. Guess what, though? Instead, we're murdering them, so about 20% are now killed in the womb. So that's another point, though. But in that context, then, I've often been marvel at this, because if you talked about aborting a dolphin or a whale or even a dog, there'd be a hue and a cry. And so imagine we need to have too many of these porpoises. And then you said, no, actually, we didn't mean that seriously. We're just talking about taking a human instead, so it's okay. You see, because that's what we do. We justify that. And it's the hidden secret. It's the number one cause of death in the world. And it's about 20%. And that's incredible. So in every sentence I make, then, multiple will be on average aborted, because more than one per second happening. So tens of millions of people. So what do we do with this? It's my view that though we do not have a clear biblical teaching, there are principles that he will not hold us accountable for knowledge we received. There is an age of accountability, it appears, of some sort, and that therefore it would seem to me that these people could be covered by the work of Christ. If that's true, and I can't prove it, if that's true, That would account for how you could then have people from every tongue, tribe, people, and nation. See the concept there? Because of that. But I don't know the answer. And I do believe, and there are multiple accounts of these kinds of things, when people have called upon the name of the Lord, even though they didn't know his name, and then he's provided the information that they needed to have. How he does that directly, I can't be so sure. But that's a very interesting thought experiment, that the majority of people in heaven then, or a huge number, would be people who died in infancy. And that would be an incredible concept, because that would account for how you could have people from every tongue, tribe, people, and nation in the heavenly places. Let me stress this. I went through this last night with Karen. It was kind of an interesting thing to do. And she said, this is really hard stuff. Really hard stuff. But the net of the matter is this. We are dying of an illness. Our physicality reveals the external problem, but it's because of an internal problem. You see the idea that it's because of us being in the line of Adam, and that has been transmitted from generation to generation. And therefore, the line of Adam is a line that leads ultimately to a Christless eternity. They don't know him. And yet, at the same time, he gives us this option. So here we are in the line of Adam, and he's giving this option of transporting us and putting us in the line of the new Adam, Christ. And he's giving this option, this possibility, this offer. And so the issue then is, why doesn't he give grace to everybody? And I can't demand grace. That's a really strange and mysterious deal. Why is it that you're here right now? Why were you born where you were born? Why has your brief life sojourn been marked so much by a greater wealth of resources and things than most people have ever known? No, we don't escape from death, but the reality is that we have been given far more than we deserve, and God has given us more than we deserve. He's given us grace. So it comes down then to God being more than fair. He's being gracious. And then the question is, but he will not hold us accountable for the light we don't have. But here's the thing, he will hold us accountable for the light we do have. So whenever I hear this question, you, even in raising the question, already know the answer. The answer is Christ. So what are you going to do about it? Otherwise, it becomes a method of trying to put it off onto someone else.